All right, here we go into the metaverse. Why is this important? What is the metaverse? Why should you care? Those are all questions we'll talk about. Today, I decided to start right up front with something that doesn't right click anymore. Yeah, there it is. So this is a definition by Matthew Ball, who's probably the most prominent VC person in the metaverse, and it has a bunch of words. It says the metaverse is a massively scaled and interoperable network of real-time rendered 3D virtual worlds. And all of those words are important, real-time being the most important, and I'll talk about that in a bit. These worlds can be experienced synchronously and persistently, which means that they persist after you leave them. Synchronously, they're effectively in real time. And that's important as well. With an effectively unlimited number of users with an individual sense of presence, which means that they have a well-defined identity, and with continuity of data. All of that means identity, history, entitlements, what they own, communications, payments. Those will all be discussed in some depth going forward. If I'm running out of time, somebody please wave. Okay, yeah. So what does that mean? These are all of those components that are necessary to make the metaverse itself work. We'll go into each of those in part B, but before that, it's important to understand why we should care. And at the risk of being hyperbolic, it's because this literally is the next step of human evolution. A lot of us will probably do Q&A about that later. Let's take a step back and talk about why this is important historically. So there are 4 stages of human evolution till now. Stage 1 is when we were hunter-gatherers and we believed in nature because there wasn't really organized religion yet. And behavior was based on consensus, loose organization. There wasn't really a tribal head that made any sense. And then people sort of started migrating to cities because agriculture became a thing. That's when organized religion was invented. Then you needed a local chieftain, so feudalism was invented. And finally, royalty was invented, right? And the important thing to note here is that all of those 3 sort of sources of identity are non-exclusive. So in the modern nation state, you're supposed to adhere to the nation state as an absolute and immutable thing. But a knight in the Middle Ages, had allegiance to religion, to feudal lords, and to royalty. And those didn't need to be necessarily differential in power. And then, that became obsolete as well because we discovered the Industrial Revolution. And we started believing in the power of the state. That gave rise to the nation state. The nation state needed young bodies to kill themselves in wars, so they invented democracy. And they needed an organizing system for economics to work well, so the corporation was invented as a fictional entity that has limited liability. And those 3 really defined the state of the world till maybe 1970, 1990, if you will, but let's take 1970 for ease of logic. And that's when the information age sort of started. And we aren't obviously here yet, but what people will believe is in the network, because belief and trust in both God and the nation state have dipped over the last 200 years. The nation state, especially the last 10 years, that's all there is that we see, especially in the West. And what that will lead to is decentralization, the power of the individual or the sovereign individual, and I don't know how the companies themselves will sort of be defined, but we have some hypotheses that we'll get into in a bit. Okay, that doesn't work well. Okay, I think I skipped one. No. So what will the information age itself look like? And there are 2 ways we can go. One way is where AI takes primacy, and one is where the blockchain takes primacy, or both, or a mix of both, right? And kind of the best way to think about it is that AI is communism and crypto is libertarianism, because AI believes in aggregating all of the data in the world and coming up with what it believes is collective good. Crypto actually says nobody is to be trusted. It's completely trustless, and therefore it's libertarianism. Yeah, and that's also interestingly why China is so down on crypto and so big on AI. So interesting things to think about. Let's zoom in on how we got here and why it matters. So when the internet began, in the 90s, let's say, I mean, obviously there was DARPA before, but the 90s is really when it became mainstream. It was read-only. You couldn't post things or create things on the internet. Corporations did, so it was read-only. And companies created content or whatever else, and companies profited from it, which was fine. And it also was kind of a way for legacy business models of the offline world to come into the online world. And it, interestingly enough, despite all this, had kind of got open standards. Web 2, which sort of started in the early 2000s, but really became big when mobile internet in 2011 took over, is read-write. You can both create content, consume content, do whatever you want with it. But the power stays with the companies because you can create stuff on Instagram, but most of the money goes to Facebook. You rent everything. You rent real estate in Web 2. And this is important and why we are seeing such pushback. If you've seen that social network documentary on Netflix, where it says if you're not paying a price for the product, you are the product. That's really where this comes from. You don't own anything, you're renting stuff from companies. And the standards are closed. Everything on Web 2 is a walled garden, as it were. Your identity on Facebook is not your identity on Twitter, is not your identity on TikTok. And it should be logically because you're a player on the internet. That's kind of what Web3 is trying to solve, where you can read and write content to it, but people create content or things, and people profit from it. And this implies digital ownership. And this is really critical because everybody keeps laughing about all the NFTs that come out now, where why am I paying for this picture? That's kind of a toy. Everything looks like a toy when it comes out. But the idea that a digital good can be owned itself is alien for most of us, especially most of us who are older, which is almost everyone here. But it's the same societal question, right? If most of you are married, I assume, you have a ring on your finger that's a diamond ring. Why does it have value? Because society deemed that it does. And when society stops deeming that it does, that's when it loses value. If you live all your life online, digital goods have value, or they will have value increasingly. And open standards are kind of what all of these are built on. And think of it as everybody going D2C. So in India, we've had these D2C consumer brands over the last 2 or 3 years. Imagine every creator in the world, every individual in the world being a free player on the internet and trying to sell their goods or services directly to everybody else without the need of an intermediary, which is why I sort of phrased it as D2C. And therefore, what does this entail? It has a few important words here. One is trustlessness, which is that you don't need to trust any actor on the internet because everybody's interests are aligned. Let's take one example, right? You have Facebook, where Facebook can decide to change the rules on you anytime for anything that's on its networks. In a Web3 world, nobody can, because all of the content flows through a contract, which can't be changed after it was made. And therefore, you don't need trust. This doesn't mean that trustlessness is a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. You're trusting that everybody's playing by the same rules, and the rules can't be changed retroactively. And we'll talk about this in the next slide, but that means that code is actually law. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Universal identity, which means that you, as a person, are represented on the internet or online. Your identity on whatever the future of Twitter is the same as your identity on LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera, and all these can be cross-collated to each other to prove that all of these are actually the same person. The third piece is actually payment rails. So the big problem in Web 2 actually was they'd actually solved most of the problems of Web 1, but they hadn't solved the problem of payments being the underlying layer of the internet. And that's what Web3 does, where everything is tokenized, and we'll get into that. But what it effectively means is that you don't need a system of credit cards and a system of identity and a system of ownership. All of those are linked to a single wallet that owns your identity and your payment rails. The same applies to digital ownership. So let's say you bought a piece of music, because that's all I care about. And you wanted to play it here because you own it, but you also wanted to play it somewhere else on the internet. That is also linked to your wallet and can go with you when you go, which means and has to imply interoperability. Interoperability standards are critical to how Web3 will work, and is the hardest one to pull off, really, because we'll get into it when we talk about the metaverse stuff. But as in any gold rush, people will all say mine is the best standard, and it takes 5 years or 10 years of churn to figure out what actually the best standard is. And sometimes the best standard doesn't even win. The most accepted standard wins. Okay, so everybody always asks this difference of what is Web3, what is blockchain, what is NFT, what is Ethereum. Web3 is a construct. Everything on Web3 is built on the blockchain. And what the blockchain is, simply computers that make strong commitments about the future. What that means is that everything on the blockchain is written once as a contract and cannot be changed later unless a majority of people decide that it be so. The most famous example, of course, of this is Bitcoin, where Satoshi decreed that there would always be only 21 million coins in circulation and no more. Nobody, not even Satoshi, can change that. That's why it makes strong commitments about the future, because the future has been written into the code itself. And therefore, to get the blockchain working, you need contracts built on the blockchain. And as I said before, code is law. Code that's written to the blockchain is immutable, which means that it can't be changed after it's been written. It's decentralized, which means that no one party has the ownership of this. Ethereum, the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik, owns 1% of Ethereum coin, I think, not more. So it's all given away. And even if he had 100%, I don't think he could control it, or 49%, he wouldn't be able to control how Ethereum functions. It's permissionless, which is that anybody who wants to be a validator of the code or the nodes themselves can decide to do so. So you don't need permissions from Facebook. And when you sign to Facebook for the first time, there's a contract that you sign with them. You don't need a contract to sign to anything on Ethereum. You can just decide to be a validator and start mining, and you're done. And they also automatically compensate. This is more contentious, and I won't get into what that means, but just take it for granted for the moment. Most contracts are written on the Ethereum blockchain just because it was the first one that actually had a programming language built in. So the reason you don't normally see anything built with Bitcoin is because Bitcoin doesn't have a programming language. It's just a contract. Ethereum comes with its own programming language that's built on C++. So most people can do it quite easily. There are other chains. I won't get into it. It's a long topic. Solana, Flow, a bunch of others that have advantages and disadvantages, but they'll all compete to sort of win on one parameter or the other. The last is tokens, right? Everybody talks about NFTs rather than just coins now. What are tokens? Tokens are an asset class. They're effectively the replacement of the LLC. This I spoke about with question marks on a slide earlier, where I mentioned that the LLC was the limited liability companies an invention of the industrial age. The token is an invention of the information age, because you can finally prove that you own something in a digital form. NFTs are non-fungible, which means that they can't be broken up. So if you buy a JPG or a music album, you can't really break that up into the sum of its parts. You can own it together, but you can't break up the object itself as it's represented. So they kind of are analogous to, if any of you play video games or have, you can buy additional things inside video games. That's kind of what NFTs do. Fungible tokens are actually far more interesting. They replace currency and actually mean that almost anybody can mint their own currency. A band can, an organization can, for purposes that are very specifically bounded to their needs. And the interoperability of those fungible tokens are almost limitless. So you can have them in certain ways. So for example, there's a video game called Axie Infinity, where they have their own token. And that token can be, the more you play, the more you earn. So it's like a multi-level marketing scheme, unfortunately. But at the core of it, the idea of doing an activity to earn money is intrinsic to fungible tokens. Moving on, and this is critical. This layer is actually almost everything that people are focusing on now. How do you make these mainstream? How do you make people accept them? How do you make actual useful use cases for them? Because the most common complaint for Web3 is there is no use case yet. People are just speculating in a lot of this, and that's true. But that's what happens. The reverse happened in Web2, where people sort of first figured out how to get user acquisition. And Facebook had billions of users before it made a single dollar. And then they sort of figured out that there was money to come. In this case, it's been the reverse. People have figured out that there's money to be made, and they're kind of hunting for use cases of all of these use cases. So the biggest and first are finance. So people have launched all kind of currencies. Most of them are rubbish. Please don't buy them, even if the government sort of keeps allowing it. And decentralized finance, which actually can be useful. It basically talks about disintermediation in a meaningful way. And what that means is that why do you need an institution to route your money if there is a permissionless way to do so? We're actually more used to this in India than the West is, because UPI effectively does this. You don't need tokens to run the UPI rails, right? But in the West, the amount of layers you have to go through to make a simple transaction happen is almost unbelievable to us in India, and therefore interesting. Gaming, I mentioned Axie, and Axie is super interesting because they're really the first people to have figured out that you can build a game where the more you play, the more the value of it goes up. Social networks, which is really an interesting use case that not many people have figured out yet. The problem with most social networks is that one party has power. The second is that discoverability of data or your interests is also going through an algorithm. Logically, Web3 can solve for some of those. Nobody's done it yet at scale because there just aren't enough users of scale. The other thing that is more likely to happen is because you don't need this monolithic power to decide what you like anymore, social media itself will split into smaller and smaller enclaves that are based on people's interest and going direct to consumer as well, right? The nature of work itself will change. So we spoke about the limited liability company as the invention of the previous era of the internet. That will change as well. It will be interest aligned, which means that you work part-time for somebody for as long as it's worth your while, and vice versa, because the tokens are aligned to your interest. It's like getting shares in a company on day minus 30 rather than day 500. And the day you feel it's not worth your while, you can leave. It gets informalized, but your work is still codified in a way that makes sense. Finally, for communities, communities and cooperatives have been around for forever. This is actually one of the most interesting pieces of how communities will work in Web3, where you can basically decentralize organizations and work together on stuff. We're hearing a lot of hype in the last year, 6 months actually, around DAOs, and most of them again are kind of all over the place. But in its essence, and we'll talk about this in a bit, this is a super powerful idea because it aligns the interests of everyone involved, right? The usual problem in large workplaces is that interests are not aligned. Finally, okay, I did all of this before we got to the metaverse because most of the terminology in the metaverse is incomprehensible before we do the stuff before this. So everybody says, oh, metaverse, it's going to be this VR exciting thing. Plot twist, all of us are already in the metaverse because all of us spend all of our working lives in there, right? How many hours do we spend on the phone plus computer every day? Upwards of 4, most certainly, probably up to 10 for most of us. And that's kind of what the metaverse is, right? It's not important that I'm walking around here. Almost everything I do actually lives online. But it's important to sort of differentiate between the metaverse and VR. VR is just a way to see the internet, right? It's not critical to how it functions. It's just the most UX effective way of making it happen. The second is that other people say, oh man, these gaming companies are already metaverse. The gaming companies are tools. Unity is a tool to build things like the metaverse, the same way that the internet was built on the TCP/IP protocol, right? Finally, back to this graph that we saw earlier, where there are several parts of the internet of all of these pieces that will be necessary to build the metaverse. And the first of those is actually hardware, right? How do you build hardware that can actually render all of this in real time? We spoke about a bunch of things earlier, which was that it must be real time, it must be persistent, it must have many, many users concurrently. Most hardware that's built today can't do that. Things that actually render VR without the need to wear a bulky headset is 5 years away, at least. Snapchat just came out with these spectacle things. They have half an hour of battery life, which is kind of useless for anything that you want to use things for. So I think this is kind of, once Apple solves this, I think that's when the shift will happen for consumers. The second is data entry itself, right? So typing is weird. if you're seeing into another world. So there'll probably be things around your wrist where that's what you do and that's how your typing happens. We type into thin air. Object capture, which means if there's an object in the real world, how do I replicate it quickly and meaningfully online? That's tech that's being built out, but only at enterprise level right now. And the last is UX layers, which I kind of spoke about in typing, but it sort of extends to other things as well. You can't actually touch things inside VR things even today. You can get like some haptic resistance by touching, but it's kind of not fully baked in. And until that is, you won't have useful things. And the problem is that we've gotten so used to iPhone 13 level stuff today, where it all works seamlessly, that we forget what it was like when the first iPhone was launched, right? When they launched the first iPhone, the Nokia CEO went on record to say that the global market for iPhones is maybe 10 million devices. In hindsight, that sounds stupid, but it sounds stupid the same way as all of this metaverse stuff sounds today. Second is networking, right? How do you make sure that you can actually get all of this enormous data to live on computer screens or phone screens or whatever? For example, the most realistic virtual environment built till date is Microsoft Flight Simulator, which in real time actually updates every airport in the world, every flight that's taking off, weather conditions everywhere in the world. And to do that, it needs 2.5 petabytes of data on a very specialized device. So how do you solve for this? You can't get that level of data flowing through pipe today. And so there's kind of ways to get around it. Video games solve for this by basically storing the environment on your device at a certain level of abstraction, but sort of streaming positional data for you. So if I'm here and Nikhil is there, Nikhil moves, the Nikhil entity is on my computer, but the movement of Nikhil is what's sent to me, things like that. So it'll be some combination of things like that, but we are some way away from it working at scale. And the reason it doesn't work at scale is latency. Data takes time to go back and forth. The mean time round trip latency from my computer to another computer, an action happens there and back is about 200 milliseconds, which you will most certainly feel. We are playing a show in an hour, and 15 milliseconds is about what we feel as time. If it's any more delayed than that getting to you through those monitors, you feel it. So 200 milliseconds is a long time to feel round trip, which is also interestingly why most games, online games, when they match you with somebody close to you, because you don't feel the latency if it's somebody in Ahmedabad, but you most certainly feel the latency if the guy is playing with you from the US. Compute. This actually takes the last example further. There are, 100 people in this room, 90 people in this room right now. Most games or virtual environments can handle about 100 people at max. So when Ariana Grande played a virtual concert inside Fortnite, this giant game, there were 65 million people who showed up. But you couldn't interact with 65 million people simultaneously. No compute system in the world can do that. You effectively partied with the 100 people in this room, and those 100 people partied with the 100 people, of which 10 of them were overlaps with you, and so on and so forth. So games shard to solve the problem of massive compute. But to go back to the definition of the metaverse, where we said that effectively unlimited people can interact together, that's not solved yet, and it's very, very hard to solve as a problem, because you need compute to be able to solve interactions at scale, which it doesn't do. And therefore, there are two kind of solutions for this that people are working on. One is edge computing, which is basically there's Nikhil's computer, there's a supercomputer node in the middle that does all the processing, sends it over the cloud, and it processes here. Or the second one is called distributed computing, where computing for all of the things in the metaverse live on everyone's phones or computers or VR screens or whatever technology comes through. And those computers together do a really small part of the compute power. But in the aggregate, you all get the best experience. Finally, and this is probably what most of you showed up for, what the hell is Facebook doing, right? This is what Facebook is doing. They're building a platform. And think of the platform as iOS. Before iOS came, there wasn't a good way to build applications for phones. You need a creation studio. You need an engine that makes the metaverse work. You need studios for artistic assets, and you need tools to be able to customize them for anybody who's actually trying to create a layer of the metaverse. You need a bunch of services that support this. You need some place where you can buy assets to build your metaverse. You need chat, you need player accounts, you need payments to be integrated. And you also need there to be an actual economy that functions inside this metaverse, right? Like consumers spend money, how is that shared between the consumer, the platform, and the developer? Somebody uses another tool made by another company inside the metaverse. How do those creators or developers sort of share revenues? All of those need to be built into a metaverse platform. Think of it like an operating system. Think of it like iOS. That's what Meta is trying to build as Facebook. They're not trying to build the entirety of the metaverse because that's A, impossible to do, B, it's not in their best interest to do so. The best reason for them to do so is because they are tied to iOS, they are tied to Android, and this is the way out. This is the way for them to become the guys who are really building the iOS version of the metaverse itself. Being Facebook, they'll probably try to take as much of data from this as possible, try to have terrible economics for creators, all of those things. Those are things to find out. But it's important that they're doing this right now because they're one of the few companies in the world that has the money to spend on figuring out a little wristband that can do all of the world's typing and touching for you. Apple, Facebook, Google, those are the only people who can build that kind of tech. So it's important that they're doing it. How it plays out, we'll see. And therefore, once you have a platform which has several little metaverses running on it, you need to solve for interoperability. What does interoperability actually mean, right? Let's say I run a music metaverse thing. It's a theme park for people who love music. Somebody else runs a similar thing for sports. I am a virtual being inside this music world. I am wearing a t-shirt for a band I love. I'm running late for this sports thing and that thing, so I just walk into that world that's run by a different company, but I'm still wearing that t-shirt. How does that work? Do you need to set standards for how my virtual avatar will work while it's working in two different ecosystems? So the avatar needs to look the same or similar. Similarly, the t-shirt that I wore has to be represented in that world, so we need to have common standards for t-shirts, clothing, skins, hairstyles. That's just a simple example. This extends to almost everything, but it's the simplest way to explain what interoperability is. And the second problem with interoperability is that it's in nobody's interest to enforce it because the platforms will always want to take as much money as possible from you. 30% is the amount iOS takes when you pay for your Spotify account on an Apple phone of every month's subscription just for being able to run on their phones. The other thing is that they actually block actual functionality. So it's actually possible to build a website app that functions just as well as an iOS or Android app. The reason you don't see them is because they block that use on iOS using the use of WebGL. So again, it's an anti-competitive activity that will at some point get them in trouble, but we might all be dead before that. The best systems that actually work with interoperability are the gaming systems, which are Unity and Unreal, the engines that run the vast majority of the world's games. And this obviously is, it's obvious enough that the incumbents who have power have no incentive to change this or to provide interoperability for you. And I'll add Facebook to that bucket as well. That's why it happens by stealth. And that's why this crypto is important. And that's why I spoke a lot about the crypto stuff before getting to the metaverse. Because the only way you'll get interoperability, and therefore this wild, exciting world of different uncorporatized systems to work, is when interoperability comes in. And the way they started was saying, this is the piece that sucks the most. Payments is what sucks the most. Because the virtual economy, all payment systems, Visa, MasterCard, whatever, they all have trade-offs. They have trade-offs between security, fees, and speed of transactions, right? So the virtual economy, and these are all legacy systems, ACH in the US, which is truly awful. The virtual economy, when it came up, should have had theoretically better payment rails. But actually, it has much worse payment rails and much worse take rates than credit cards, right? Apple takes 30%. Roblox, the video game company, takes 75% of your revenue, or rather it gives you 25% of the revenue that a user makes from the game itself. That's why Ethereum will win as the payment rails of the next internet. Because Ethereum does a bunch of things, or actually all cryptocurrencies, but we'll take Ethereum as an example, because it creates all of the things that are important for interoperability within these worlds. It creates a single sign-on, which means that your Ethereum wallet, MetaMask, allows you to sign on to any website without additional login. Ethereum or Solidity or whoever else actually doesn't keep that data. You do. Even the platform you're interacting with doesn't keep the data. It's just the knowledge that this transaction happened. Identity. Again, going between Facebook's world, my world, the sports world I took as an example, there has to be a way of meaningfully proving that this is the same person represented by his virtual self or her that goes between these worlds. So you need to solve for identity in a meaningful way. Similarly for ownership, anything I bought, that t-shirt that I bought on my app has to go into another world, and therefore the ownership of it is important to prove. And finally, payment, right? When you're buying something in one world or moving one good from one world to the other, there should be fees between that, and all those should be seamless and linked to the same thing. So this effectively solves a bunch of different problems for the internet itself, no, but not without problems. The primary problem today being that the problem that they tried to solve for, actually, they haven't managed to, because the way fees works on the blockchain or on Web3 is that it's based on computational power, and computational power costs money. So I don't know if any of you read about this Constitution DAO thing this week, where a bunch of people pooled in money and decided to buy the US Constitution on auction. Most of them actually bid about $500 each into that pool, and they were promised that they would get their money back with the gas fees deducted. And the gas fees for $500 of transaction was $90 for going and coming back. That's still unreasonable. It's almost as bad as Apple. There are technological solutions coming to that problem in the future, but I just wanted to flag that those exist today and will probably exist for a couple of years more. Coming to social media, the arts, which is actually why I'm interested in it, and what, as we'll talk in a minute, what we are building for this world. This actually means fundamentally different relationships between consumers, creators, and platforms. Social networks in Web3 will be powered by 2 or 3 important things. The first is that, as I said before, the monolithic nature of Web2, where you have one Facebook or one Instagram, will get broken up into really smaller communities where people sort of get interested in something and decide to stay. We're already seeing that on Discord, which is like Slack, but not for work, which kind of began as a gaming first thing, but now is probably the most vibrant place to discuss stuff on the internet. Status will become important, just like social status is important in Web2. Status will become important through ownership and through exclusivity of access. What that means is, if you've seen the whole Bored Ape Yacht Club thing, where people again bought these random JPEGs, that's now probably the hardest club in the world to get into. And because it's based around ownership, and it's based around the fact that only 10,000 people have one of these at a given point of time. The third is that the environments will be virtual, which is really just the metaverse piece. The rest of it, the rest of the pieces that are in here are actually Web3. Only the third piece is the metaverse, where the environments that we'll walk through or work in, and the content we'll work with, will be both virtual and completely interactive. And that's a completely fundamental change in how content is produced and created. And the fourth is interoperability, which I've mentioned a bunch of times. What does this mean for specific arts, right? What does it solve for creators, artists, musicians? It's also something called the 1,000 True Fans model, which is an article that was written 12 years ago now by Kevin Kelly of Wired, where he said that as a creator or a creative person, you actually don't need to have 1 million people who care about your work. You only need 1,000 people to care, because you can make a living from that. And things like Patreon, Kickstarter, all of these crowdfunding things, those came up as a sort of solution to that problem, saying, let's build these 1,000 true fans who care about stuff. But it's been hard. It's been hard to build that in Web 2. And last year, actually, even more interestingly, Legion of A16Z said that you don't need 1,000 fans, you need 100 fans maybe, if the 100 fans care even more. And she actually proved it because she auctioned an interview of herself and one person bought it. So you actually need just one true fan. You don't need 1,000 or 100 at scale. Um, of course, this is all easier than it sounds. It sounds utopian because the vast majority of people will come in for free. They'll watch stuff for free. Some of those will sort of buy stuff once. They'll buy the T-shirt and go away, and some of those will become the 1,000, 100, one true fan of what you produce. For music specifically is what I'm most interested in, what I'm building. The types of events themselves would change because virtual events can augment live much better than they could earlier. As I mentioned before, Travis Scott did a concert with 30 million people in Fortnite. Ariana Grande did 65 million, which is crazy. But also you can sort of flip this, right? We were working with this band in India where in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody was doing live streaming as a way of making some money, and we realized that that live streaming model sucks, right? It's very boring to watch a concert on a TV screen. It's like watching a YouTube video. Why is it exciting, right? So we went to them and we said, can we do this differently? Can we actually limit this to 10 people? There are only 10 people who are watching this live stream at a given point of time, but it's completely interactive for them. They can talk to you, they can make requests, you can tell them jokes, you can tell them the history of the songs in a way that you can't do when there are 1,000 people watching. And, the band said, yeah, but who will pay any money for this? Indian fans are who they are. And we said, sure, let's find out. Let's find out. There's no harm, right? And the price point for 10 people to watch this live streamed concert was $3,500, which is not something that we had sort of thought of when we did this. Sorry, 3.5 lakhs, $5,000. So $500 a head, which you wouldn't think of in an Indian context. But the point is, nobody's asked the question. We've all become inured to the idea that the price of consumption is zero. Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, all the music in the world is available there, and you can just go there and click and watch. But even if you wanted to pay more because this is an artist you love, doing so is very, very hard. So how do we make that easier? Right? This example is one. The Ariana Grande concert example is two. In the Ariana Grande concert, 65 million people showed up and it was free. But 1 million of them bought the T-shirt. So you make attendance free, but you make the add-ons worth it. Some percentage of people will buy those. This is the freemium model from every kind of app, every kind of game, but applied to music, right? Let's see if it works. Second, content has value again, right? As we spoke. You'll still put your music on Spotify because people discover it there, but you create value through experiences, through exclusivity, through the fact that you can now own music. So yeah, we are doing some stuff with NFTs, and there's a song about the impermanence of time with this group. And the impermanence of time is represented in the NFT by the fact that every time you play this NFT inside the player, it reduces in quality, the same way as vinyl records did, but nothing digital does. So the more you play it, the worse sounding it gets. So is there value in it because you played it more, or is there value in it if you never play it? It's an interesting question to ask about art itself, right? So yeah, the third is actually harnessing fans. So tickets, collectibles, all of the NFT stuff that we spoke about, but also generative music, right? Today on TikTok or wherever, when you create a reel and you sort of use somebody's music on it, the artist makes a little bit of money. You make no money as a creator because the payment rails aren't built into TikTok, right? In Web3, when the payment rails come, user-generated content has value, regenerating music has value, remixing music has value, because both you and the creator created a contract on this on day one. You created a contract where it said, if you reuse my music, you don't need to come to me for rights. The revenue share is written into the smart contract of this music that's out there on the internet. Every time it makes money, you make money and I make money because we've established what our revenue share will be. This will be the hardest bit to pull off, by the way, because the record labels are still here. But that's why the record labels should go. So if I were to ask you what people care more about and spend more time in their lives doing, music would come, in terms of things people are crazy about: religion, sports, politics, and music. Gaming would come a little lower. But the gaming industry is $180 billion. and the music industry is $20 billion globally. And it stayed $20 billion. It was $20 billion in 2001. It dipped to 10, and it's back up to 20 now after 20 years. This is not inflation adjusted, it's like nominal dollars, which means it's actually it's shrunk to half on an inflation adjusted basis. And that's because 75% of the world's music is owned by 3 companies today. And that needs to change. Because fans for artists that come up in the future, not past artists, that's done, they can take share in artists' futures. Implicitly, explicitly, whatever. Every band is effectively, every musician is an organization, right? But the shareholders of that organization and the people who put up the money for work to happen today is a record label that takes all the profits. This is new and maybe 50 years old as a concept. If you were to take Mozart's music, the patron of Mozart's music was the Emperor of Austria. He used to commission all his work and then you could listen to it for free. When Baba Alauddin Khan set up the Meher Gharana, the king of Meher used to pay for all of his stuff. All of us can be 1,000th of the Emperor of Austria and become part of artists' careers if we care. And all of us care about one person or 2 people. And that's enough. And that will happen both implicitly, by the fact that you can now buy a song where you get 1% of the royalty rights for perpetuity, but that's only that song. The second is by actually each artist forming an autonomous organization where fans both can buy in stuff or they can earn stuff, which means that if typically I'm an artist starting out and I get 50,000 streams of a song on a platform, I give this to you, all of the 1,000 people who care about my music. I give it to you as a task to say, go out and make this 50,000 streams into 200,000 for my next song. And if you do, I'll reward you with tokens. You have skin in the game. If that artist becomes successful, those tokens have more value. You'll put in the work to make that happen. That's far in the future, but the tools to do so are there today. You're wondering why I spend so much time in talking about music. Because that's what we are building. This is not meant to be a pitch deck for what I am doing, but this is what I am doing. We are building all of the stuff that that I spoke about till now for music. It's called Alive. So it's a metaverse for music. We launch sometime in March, and we have our fingers very tightly crossed. But open to Q&A. The mic's not on, but I can hear you.
Okay, do you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
What do the governments do in such a metaverse? How do they get a share of the pie? What's their role? Do you think they would just give that up and watch all of this happen?
They won't. Every time there is a change in the fundamental nature of things changing, there is strife, right? That's natural. So when, as we said on some faraway slide in the past, when feudalism changed to the industrial age, there was a problem, right? In England, why is England still a monarchy, right? It's notionally still a monarchy, but the politicians have all the power. But that transfer of power wasn't easy. And it won't be easy this time as well, because you will have states who will try to control it, and they are, right? You've read what they want to do with crypto in every country in the world. Right. That will happen, and you'll see this transitional phase. Maybe they'll win. In China's case, I think they'll certainly win, because they can. But for the rest of us, I don't know the answer of who wins, but this is, this one vision of the future that I am invested in personally. So I hope this wins, but governments won't give up without a fight, right? They'll try to regulate, they'll try to ban, they'll do whatever it takes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned this concept of latency, right? And you feel it if it's above 30 milliseconds or
Sure.
So I really like this concept of doing live jamming with people around the world.
Right.
Which is really hard to do right
It's super hard, you can't do it. Yeah.
So is this like an unsolvable problem, or do you think there's work being done?
There is work being done. There's a couple of players that do it, Jamkazam, and there's another one that NEC worked with. I forget the name. I can just mail me. I'll tell you what it is. But People are trying to do it by kind of anticipating what it does. The simplest way to kind of do it is what actually Instagram does, right? Where you can post facto jam over somebody, but the real-time stuff is almost impossible to pull off. Forget another computer, right? When you're recording stuff into your own computer, you can feel the latency, right? If you play guitar into a computer and you're playing fast enough, you can feel it. You've hit the note and the note comes like just a tiny millisecond later, and modern computers do it well, but most still don't. So it's not just internet latency, it's also processing latency.
Yeah, perhaps the right question to ask someone from IIM Ahmedabad. With all this fragmentation and all this decentralization, what then will be the role of branding?
Oh, that's a good one. I haven't thought about it in precisely that frame before, but it's the same question as what D2C brands do. Are you an FMCG person, sir? Yeah, I figured. Okay, so that's happened in FMCG already, right? I don't need to go to this future to see what it is. D2C brands have taken market share. So you're familiar with Harry's or Dollar Shave Club? So Dollar Shave Club did this, right? Where everybody said you're stupid for taking on Gillette. And they said, but Gillette's pricing is weird because they charge for the blades and force me to pay almost nothing for the handle, right? And they said, we'll flip it. You just pay $1 a month for blades that we ship to you. And they finally got bought, or Harry's, or any of these brands. So because the internet allows you to market and grow exponentially at scale, because you don't need distribution anymore, because distribution is a service. Earlier you needed power to get onto physical shelves, right? Now you don't, because the internet is your shelf, and you can sell to anybody in the world who can pay for it. So distribution goes away, therefore anybody can start a brand. How you build a brand and scale it, those problems still stay the same. Does that answer your question?
It does, because what you're saying now is a lot of functionality.
Yeah.
Getting things done.
It's the rails, yeah.
Functionality is a separate issue altogether.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think the rules of branding don't change, they just evolve for each generation. So yeah, we'll figure it out. Yeah, sure.
Hi, Abhijit. Over here.
Yeah, hi.
Thanks, this is a very interesting talk. One question I had is, even if I'm able to set up the tokens, all of these things,
Sure.
I'm still dependent on some platform like Spotify, hope to be discovered, to gather my 1,000
True fans, yeah.
etc. So they can essentially act as rent seekers, which I can't get past. They can throttle my progress, right? So how does Web 3.2
Right.
cover that?
It's the biggest unsolved problem in Web3, actually. The discoverability piece is actually the hardest piece to solve for two reasons. One is that, yeah, as you said, they're the gatekeepers, so they can throttle access. Any platform can decide to do so. Music is actually the last one to do so, but if you're right at Twitter, and Twitter is your platform, and they cut you off, what can you do, right? That's a big problem. That's one. Presumably, there'll be at some point a Web3 version that's decentralized, but nobody can figure out what the rules are for decentralization, right? Let's take hate speech. Today, Facebook can say, okay, Trump has now committed hate speech, whatever that means, and he's deplatformed. But somebody's deciding. If you even leave it to the majority of Twitter users to say the majority of users will decide for each violation what happens, you can't fix it because the majority normally behaves in equally idiotic ways, right? So nobody's come up with a good way for voting to, or democratic ways or decentralized ways for decision making to happen for things like that. That's one. Two is actually a completely different type of discovery problem. If you have a metaverse, when you go to Instagram or TikTok, actually TikTok is the world's best at it, you just scroll and you find out what you like, right? In a virtual world, what are you looking at? Is it a city? Am I walking through a city? What am I finding, right? That discovery problem is even harder. If you've read Snow Crash, which is the book that kind of invented the word metaverse, it's like you're replacing virtual and real world things in the virtual world and trying to work with that. I don't think UX works like that. All UX in its first generation is skeuomorphic, which means that it sort of replicates the real world and then it moves to things that are native. So we'll see the same thing happening here, where you'll see these worlds and cities. If you remember the iPhone, earlier everything was on one, when you had a letterpad, it looked like an actual letterpad and you would write in it. And then they said this looks like, it doesn't look great and doesn't matter what it looks like. It should look like something that's native to digital. And now almost every note-taking app looks like a blank sheet, right? The same thing will happen here. So that discovery problem is yet to be solved as well. Does that answer? Yeah.
So Abhijit, coming back to music,
Yeah.
suppose you consider the music universe.
Sure.
Now, I figure, there are these three stakeholders, like you who's creating the content,
Sure.
me who am, listening,
Yeah.
and possibly a third one who could be the aggregator, or maybe, trying to derive some business out of it. So can you please explain in simplistic terms that what these stakeholders, what are the value adds to them through this metaverse? Or how can they,
Yeah, extract
evaluate the
value or
process? Yeah.
whatever. So for fans, I think the biggest thing is to be closer to people they care about, because the distance from a fan to the musicians they love is large. So I took the example of the band that we worked with, where we sort of had these 10 people showing up. That's a real problem being solved for fans, right? Because you can listen to that music on Spotify or YouTube whenever you want, but being in the same room as them is worth something. For the bands, again, this band that we worked with made 20,000 rupees over the last 2 years from Spotify for 5 people. So clearly they're not making any money from this. And for them, this is actually a way to make a living, because most of your listening may come from 10 million people or a million people, but the people who will actually buy things that and part with their money in exchange for them is 20%. This is actually real data. So something like 76% of musician data in the West, not India, comes from 16% of fans. This is the way to reach those 16% and actually derive value. For the platform, which is also us, we take rates. We take a share of the revenue. So we make money. If more fans buy things, we make money. If more bands come onto the platform, we make money.
Hi. Hi, Abhijit. One of the biggest problem of music is about intellectual property.
Right.
And I think that's debatable. I mean, I love Carnatic music, and one of the problem is, whose composition is this?
No,
Who
you should
owns?
stay for the concert, by the way. It's almost entirely Carnatic music.
So this question about, and not just for that,
Yeah.
original content and intellectual property. So if you have smaller communities,
Right.
they may just replicate, and who owns, who does? Will Metaverse help this, or will it?
I don't quite get the question, I think, but I think what you're saying, what is the meaning of intellectual property?
Yeah, so will it lose its relevance?
No, I think, in fact, it'll go back, where you can consume almost everything for free. But if you want to own it, you must pay a price. Or if you want to pay for its development, you must pay a price. See, because even copyright as a function, do you know why copyright is 70 years? Because the Disney Corporation did this thing, right?
Yeah.
So there is nothing that's sacred about copyright as a construct. It's a construct of the 20th century to solve 20th century problems, right? We'll come up with a new set of, so like basically if you put all the music on the chain and say all revenue from this, 80% will always go back to the band. Every time that piece of music is used on chain, the money will flow. And that 20% is then shared by whoever remixed it, did whatever with it, which actually makes it far clearer than notional copyright that's enforced through 84 different gatekeepers.
Except that we don't know what's going to happen to the past music. So.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Yeah, I don't think, which is also why, by the way, I don't know if you've been following this, but Hypnosis and Blackstone just bought $1 billion plus of music rights themselves,
Yeah,
right?
that's what, yeah.
And that's why they're doing it, because they're just getting it off their hands. They're saying take care of catalog as a financial asset that pays an annuity. It doesn't actually do anything else.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Hi.
So when you mentioned about the 1,000 true fans model, you mentioned that platforms like Patreon don't quite cut the mustard.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? And also, I guess related to that is what would be the ideal platform for the new crop of journalists who are self-publishing or have a small
Journalists?
Yeah. Like, they have
Career
a small
advice.
media or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, this is turning
What
into.
would be the ideal model?
Sure. So Mirror is really good. Mirror.xyz is fabulous because they're putting a lot of this on chain. It's early, but you should grab the real estate early if you can. The Generalist is really good. What else? I mean, Substack is okay, but I think it's a little bit of hype. But the Generalist is very, very good. Mirror, Ghost, build your own presence. I think the future is away from established media and building your own brand. Patreon has two problems. One is that it doesn't have a clear value proposition for fans. You go there and you pay, and then to consume you have to go somewhere else, right? So let's say there's an AMA with you every month. You don't consume it on Patreon. You go to a paywalled Vimeo link that you have to sign in using your Patreon credentials. That's 3 layers of UX to watch an AMA every month. Why would I do that, right? So the problem is that there are 3 bits of this creator economy, right? There's consumption, there's engagement, and there's monetization. If you are a horizontal platform, you can't do all 3. And Patreon is a horizontal platform. You can't consume, engage, and monetize because then it becomes a giant mess, right? So actually, before we built this metaverse thing, that's what we were building. We were building a vertical Patreon for music where you could consume and engage. And then we realized the app doesn't work. We'll have to build all 3, but still people won't come because it's painful to engage. So we said, let's forget the app itself. Let's build for the future. Let's build in the metaverse.
I had a question. Actually, like, if the metaverse develops, how is this going to impact conventional social interaction? Like, do you think the majority of population is going to?
So the unfortunate bit is that you can say that for things today, all the things we fight about on traditional internet don't matter to about 60% of India, right? And 80% of sub-Saharan Africa and whatever else, right? But they're still what we fill most of our mind and time with. Most of the country of the world doesn't care. They're worried about their other worries, right? It's the same thing. Out of 7 billion people on Earth, 1 billion will be on this, 6 billion will be worrying about other problems. When technology becomes easier, the dystopian version of this future is that everybody's just plugged into the metaverse because nobody knows. And every generation, as I said, talks about this, right? Oh, television will kill everybody. When people our age become parents, television is whatever it is, right? It's something you grew up with. So every generation thinks that the next generation's invention sucks and is like the end of mankind as we know it. But it's not. People find their way. People find a way to unplug. People find a way to plug better. You figure it out.
Last question.
Hi. Yeah.
Talked about religion, sport, politics.
Yeah.
Music.
Just my frame.
Yeah, it's a good framework. Like
Yeah.
sports is one where of the things you mentioned.
Yeah.
A fan wants to experience exactly what a
Sure.
performer is experiencing. They don't just want to engage with the performer, right? You want
Right.
to feel what it's like to score a goal.
Sure.
So, and then you have a similar music kind of model of host broadcasters, governing bodies like record labels and music, who own all the content, right?
Sure.
What is the opportunity you see in sports that might not, given in your ranking, like it seems like there's a lot of opportunity in sports.
Yeah. So sports is actually one where the best ones have been built. Do you know NBA Top Shot? Right? So Top Shot is the guys who really actually made it mainstream. And they made it mainstream by doing something very interesting. You don't need a wallet. You don't need an Ethereum wallet to use NBA Top Shot. And that just opens up the world, right? Because most crypto projects are for people who already have a wallet, which is like 0.01% of people, right? At this point. Actually, how many people have a MetaMask wallet or a Phantom wallet or anything else? Like 10 people. So yeah, like 10%. That's great, actually. I should push this more. So the reason they made money was because they said, this is an NFT, but it's an NFT at the back end. At the front end, as a user, you don't see the crypto. You go and you buy the collections. It's like trump cards, right? It's exactly the same as digital trump cards. You go in and you buy those and you collect them because you collect them. You collect them because you collected baseball cards when you were young. This is just a digital form of those, right? Playing as a player, I guess people can sell it. I mean, you saw the PSG thing, right? I mean, it paid for itself in a day. So I don't know, man. I'm not a sports person, and actually, frankly, I'm not even a gaming person, so I'm the worst person to build this. But anyway, so I think sports is actually much easier to build because I think the collectible thing is much bigger. The stats thing is much bigger there. I think MPL will do fabulous things with cricket in India because they also own regulators, so they'll find it way easier to do it. Dream 11. So I think just the stats plus pictures plus thing is enough in sports. People don't actually want to experience it. Anyway, the tech isn't there. The tech to sort of do it at scale doesn't exist. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.